Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin. Thank you all very much for attending our inaugural International Spring School. So we're going to be talking today about the amazing Simone Téry, French author, erratic comet in her own description, a female figure that deserves a lot more attention. So I'm just going to make a couple of remarks about James Joyce because we're looking at the original translation and scholarship of Laura on Simone Téry. So Laura's going to take over in just a couple of minutes. So Simone met James Joyce in Paris in the late Trianon restaurant by the Gare du Montparnasse in 1925, and they had a conversation. He didn't want to be interviewed, but there is a chapter in Ile des Bardes, the Isle of Poets, still untranslated fully, still unpublished in English translation for audiences in the Anglo sphere, which is kind of tragic because it's a brilliant book, as you'll hear from Laura's translation in just a moment. So we hope to find a publisher to move Simone Téry more into the English reading public. She was writing to communicate Irish consciousness to French audiences. So James Joyce, just really quickly, James Joyce is sometimes considered Ireland's most innovative, most interesting author. His first book is Dubliners, 15 stories published in 1914, containing what is usually considered the greatest short story of the 20th century, The Dead, which has been dramatized into film and into sometimes even opera, musicals, theater productions, and is a celebration. Joyce was suffering from fever in Rome, and he'd written over several years the different sketches he described Dublin as this paralysis of a city. He used a medical term, hemiplegia. And after he was suffering from this fever, he felt that he'd been unfair to Dublin, too harsh. And so he wanted to celebrate the hospitality of the Dublin Christmas party that his maiden aunts held in Usher's Island. And we're still waiting for the Irish state to purchase that house, which is there in Usher's Island. It's had different owners, and if the Irish state would buy that, it would make a fantastic Joycean museum or Joycean spot, because that story does celebrate a quintessential value in Ireland, which is generosity and hospitality. The next work he writes is Portrait of the Artist. In 5 chapters, he just gives the description of the growth of consciousness. Fantastic book. The opening chapter is from the point of view of a child. So it's like once upon a time, and a very nice time was, down the road came a moo cow, and the moo cow's name was Baby Tuku. And so the first chapter is in the idiom and consciousness of a little child. And then each chapter, it's 5 chapters, the prose grows up as the protagonist grows up. So it's a little bit more sophisticated in chapter 2. As he goes from child to early adolescence. Chapter 3, he's starting to become a poet. Chapter 4, he's full of Byron and Shelley and all these theories of derived from Thomas Aquinas. And then chapter 5, he's ready to leave Ireland. Right. So that's when he introduces the character of Stephen Dedalus, who is an alter ego version of James Joyce himself and his growth. The third book is. In Joyce's journey is Ulysses, published in Paris in 1922. First book published by Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company. Joyce spent 7 years writing it, and again he's in the book in the character of Stephen Dedalus. And the problem for Joyce is to move out of the wounded narcissistic egotism of the younger James Joyce, Stephen Dedalus, and find a more humane, compassionate self. And he bridges that problem by introducing the figure of Leopold Bloom, the more humane Jewish seller of advertisements, whose wife, Molly Bloom, is having an affair with Blazes Boylan through the novel. The 18 episodes of Ulysses are some of the most innovative and brilliant evocations of urban life. It's often considered the greatest novel of the 20th century, certainly the most demanding, most innovative. And our friend A.E. has the best lines in episode 9, the library episode, the Scylla and Charybdis episode. And I'm going to read a little bit from that in a moment. And the last work then that Joyce spends 17 years working on is Finnegan's Wake, published in 1939. And then he was going to write one more book on the ocean, But at that point, God said, look, I'm the one who's the creative spirit in this universe. It's time to come home. And then Joyce expired in Zurich, where he was buried in 1941. So I'm going to read a little meditation in stream of consciousness of Stephen Dedalus in the library, the National Library in Dublin, as he's thinking about what he owes A.E. George Russell. And because he's also theorizing about Shakespeare and also Thomas Aquinas, and also how he doesn't need literary fathers. So many Irish writers acknowledge A.E. Russell as their literary father. The voice of Stephen Dedalus is very interesting. Okay, so I'll just read this quickly. So, how now, Sirrah, that pound he lent you when you were hungry? Marry, I wanted it. Take thou this noble. Go to. You spent most of it in Georgina Johnson's bed, clergyman's daughter, agon bite of inwit. Do you intend to pay it back? Oh, yes. When? Now. Sorry, my timer. When? Now? Well, no. When? Then. I paid my way. Steady on. He's from beyond Boyne Water, the northeast corner. You owe it. Wait. 5 months. Molecules all change. I am other I now. Other I got pound. Buzz, buzz. But I, entelechy, form of forms, am I by memory because under ever-changing forms? I that sinned and prayed and fasted, a child con me saved from pandies. I and I and I, A.E., I owe you. Now, in the merch department of the A.E. Russell Society, that's definitely a T-shirt in our future, just so we know. In that little meditation, it's deeper than just the money. There's a little bit of humor that we're supposed to change our molecules every 5-7 years, whatever. So he's saying, I am another I now. So the guy who owes the money is a different molecular being. But in the structure of Ulysses and in the structure of Joyce's thinking, Joyce knocked on A.E.'s door at the age of 20 in 1902. And any young Irish writer who knocked on A.E.'s door, A.E. would spend hours talking to them about planes of existence, theosophy, emanations from the divinity, the spiritual side of art. And the basic idea of Ulysses is metempsychosis, which is introduced in episode 4. Metempsychosis is in the first book of Madame Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. It's a technical term for reincarnation. And so the aesthetic conceit of Ulysses is pure A.E., that Dedalus and Bloom and Molly Bloom are reincarnations of versions of Penelope, Odysseus, etc. Telemachus, the son of Odysseus from Homer's Odyssey. And so the A.E.I.O.U. is at a deeper level than simply a little joke in Stephen Dedalus's mind. The other thing to say about A.E.I.O.U. is that A.E. in the National Library episode, when Stephen Dedalus is starting to debate his theory that you don't need literary fathers, he has A.E. leave, right? So because A.E. has some of the most brilliant and interesting ideas about the spirituality of art, and if Dedalus had started to spin out this nihilistic theory that you don't need a kind of a succession of debts to artistic precursors and antecedents, almost certainly A.E., if he'd stayed, would have squashed or at least limited that debate. So it's interesting that A.E. has to kind of has to leave so that Stephen Dedalus can unleash his nihilistic, somewhat narcissistic theory on the librarian in the rest of that episode. Where is A.E. going? He's going to the Hermetic Society because it's a Thursday night. It's June 16th on a Thursday. And then later on, there's going to be a gathering in George Moore's house. Both places Dedalus is excluded from. He doesn't attend the Hermetic Society. They have a special knock to let you get in the door. And also, he's not invited to George Moore. So James Joyce is very much like a Dante. Dante invents his 9 circles of hell to put his different enemies in. James Joyce not only spoke in his family Italian, but James Joyce was soaked not just in Dante, but in the psychology of resentment and revenge of Dante. Just the last thing I'll say about Dante is Dante put several popes in his 9 circles of hell, which is always very interesting. Long before we have the Protestant Reformation, we have a sort of a criticism of the corruption in the Italian papacy. So Joyce is a sort of an Irish Dante in that he's avenging himself in Ulysses on different people, but he leaves A.E. Russell largely alone and acknowledges his debt, moves him out of the library so that he can avenge himself on other figures. So that's just a little portrait of A.E. and James Joyce, and now I'll turn it over to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, because that was a really good presentation of the connection between A.E. and Joyce. What I'll be presenting on is a little bit of the biography of Simone Téry, her connection with A.E., and then finally the main points of the chapter that Simone wrote about James Joyce. And so this is the third segment of the A.E., Friends of A.E. series. And so the first time I talked about Simone Téry, I talked about her chapter specifically on A.E., and the second one was on George Moore, and now James Joyce. So Simone wrote two significant books about Ireland in her early 20s. Both haven't been published in English, and I recently found out that one is translated into English and waiting to be published. And so I'm trying to get those conversations started again, so that could happen. And so people who are interested in reading her books on Ireland and the great Irish writers are able to do that if they don't know French. But most people are familiar with the series of questions that about what people could seek in A.E. I'll just read a couple about, do you have doubts about fate, about the origin of the universe and its end? Go see A.E. Or are your worries more mundane? And like George Moore, you are just looking for a house in which to pass the winter in Dublin. It is A.E. who will find it for you. And do you need a friend? A.E. is always there. So, and I know that there's a sign in Lurgan, and Michael has quoted that in his book. But Simone Téry was a courageous and determined French journalist who wrote two significant books on Ireland. And it was her times in Ireland in the 1920s, as well as her lifelong friendship, that shaped her life and her career. She grew up in a family of journalists. So her father was Gustave Téry, who ran he was the editor of the, sorry, to have more delicate touch. He was the editor of L'Œuvre, and Simone would eventually work for him or write articles for that newspaper. Her mother's an interesting journalist herself, and actually is better known than Simone. And actually when these two were married and they were living in Carcassonne in southern France when Simone was born, and then André was the one who had the job as a journalist, and she was trying to find a job at her newspaper for Gustave. So this was in about 1904. So she was in the second generation of journalists and kind of led the way for the third generation of journalists, of which Simone Téry was a part, and made it easier for women to start a career in journalism at an earlier age. And then, but the family was all actively or politically engaged, so it was sort of no surprise that Simone would fall into journalism. And she herself said in an interview, "Je suis née dans l'encre de l'imprimerie." So I was born in printer's ink. Let's see. So her two books, so published in 1923, was the first one, En Irlande, de la guerre d'indépendance à la guerre civile, so from the War of Independence to the Civil War. And she dedicated that to her friends in Ireland. And it was during this time that she got to know AE, and they would meet roughly twice a week. And of course, he would have a significant impact, which I'll mention more later. Um, I need to catch up a little bit more on my biography part. So mother and daughter shared journalistic aptitude and love of travel, and their careers would take them all over the world. Oftentimes they would be reporting in the same country, including Ireland, at the same time, but for different papers. And although they supported each other and spoke of each other positively, they led very separate lives. But it was kind of interestingly, Patrick and I were sort of scouting out places where Simone lived in Paris, and we found that, we found where Andre spent the last the last years of her life was on Boulevard Saint-Germain, and Simone Téry would eventually, when her mother passed away, she would move into that apartment and live there till she died. But when Téry was 7, her parents divorced and her mother didn't get custody, but all parents kept a steady watch on her education and her career. And she had a good relationship with her stepfather. And when she had, everyone took care of her education. And so she did well in school, and then started teaching in Morocco, which was a French colony. And she was there for 2 years. And then Gustave, her father, asked her to go to Ireland to report on the events there, and that ended her teaching career. So in that book, she was able to secure a lot of significant interviews with Eamon de Valera, Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, and members of Sinn Féin. So this was when she's going to Ireland in 21. She's only 24, so it's pretty impressive to have done that at that age. And that book was used as an invaluable chronicle of the turbulent and critical period in Irish history. Marilyn Gaddis Rose did quite a lot of work in the field of translation. She explains that Téry does not write about Irish politics after En Irlande. However, her time in Ireland and her friendship with AE established the direction of her career. She would break from her father and seek out anti-capitalist trouble spots where guerrilla warfare allowed her to defend herself with bluff, charm, and a canny appeal to chivalry. One of the first to recognize Nazism, she threatened a hunger strike. And then she later admitted that it was the Irish patriots who gave her that idea. So she threatened a hunger strike if Le Journal, the newspaper, would not print her expose. In 1935, after a visit to the Soviet Union, she began her lifelong affiliation with the French Communist Party and its daily paper, L'Humanité. So when she was in Ireland, I'm not sure, this is, I believe, not far from Rathgar, 19 Adelaide Road, Dublin. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if anyone recognize perhaps that address. Je ne sais pas sûr. But Téry's insightful and candid writing, still unpublished in English and mostly out of print, illuminated the humanity of the Irish to the French reading public. She felt that the Irish were misunderstood and caricatured in the press, and she reminded French readers that the French and Irish histories were more alike than different. And she went on to say that the French should look to the Irish to rediscover their own Celtic soul that the French had lost. So in talking about her time in Ireland and writing her first book, she exclaims, "In reality, her assignment in Ireland, was the great revelation of my life. In this atmosphere of youth, enthusiasm, and mystic dreaminess, I found myself in my country, in my land, among my race. I discovered with joy that I was a Celt." And then upon her return to France after that first book, she wanted to go back to Ireland, and her father couldn't see the sense since Ireland was out of the news at the time. and their relationship was a bit strained, and so he was no longer supporting her. And so she applied for travel grants, and she was able to go back to Ireland. And that's where she compiled the interviews that we've been slowly presenting. And when interviewed, she was asked if any of the writers made a lasting impression on her, and she said, "Certainly, the very dear, great A.E., who stayed my friend, A.E., a sage like there were in antiquity." In fact, that dedication to Ildebard, and maybe you had time to look, is to A.E. So in all the grand writers that she writes about, she chooses him to say that he was the one that made the lasting impact. And avec mon admiration and ma reconnaissance, which is gratitude, and mon affection. Despite the modest subtitle on Ildebard, which was, I guess it didn't say that, but notes on sorry, I'm looking at the wrong. Notes on la littérature irlandaise, so notes, but it was actually a well-respected book that was used for literary debates. And in the late 1920s, Simone receives another grant and travels to Asia. In her return to New York, that overlaps with A.E.'s visit to the United States. And then A.E. describes this, their meeting, in a letter to Miss L.R. Bernstein in 1929. It says, Simone will inspire A.E.'s poem In a Strange City, which I hope to share tonight. A poem which reflects his A.E.'s certainty that he and Simone had loved each other in past lives. In the letter, he writes, "The girl in The Strange City suggested poetry to me, though I have drawn her several times. She is an enchanting French girl who was in Ireland for some months 4 years ago, a world roamer. I get letters from her from Paris, Italy, Algiers, Suez, Saigon, Japan, China, Honolulu, all within 6 months. And when I was in New York, our paths crossed for a day. She was going back to Paris from China, and I was just beginning my American trip. We were so delighted at meeting in that big, strange city that we took a motor car and drove around the park for 4 hours, holding each other's hands. I expect I know her from the beginning of the world. We made friends so quickly, in spite of our nearly 40 years between our ages." He also notes that Simone inspires poetry rather than painting because she cannot stay in one place for too long. And so it's impossible to have her sit and pose. But with poetry, one can follow her with imagination, he said. And that was where the erratic comment came up, that fact that she couldn't stay fixed in one place. He called her the erratic comment. And their deep connection reappears in 1935 when she feels a premonition that she must go to see A.E., and this is when he's near death. And she doesn't know that at the time, but she arrives, uninvited, and it's sadly the day after he dies. But that premonition was so strong to get there to see him. Okay. And then her career continues. In 1935, while writing from the front lines in Spain, she meets her soon-to-be husband, Juan Shabazz, a writer and member of the Alliance of Anti-Fascist Intellectuals. In 1940, she takes the last boat to Mexico from France and joins Shabazz in Cuba, where he's exiled. And she works for a progressive Cuban press there and writes a novel, Où l'aube se lève, where the dawn breaks. And that was published in the United States. And then it was later republished in France. She adds her reportage from Spain into her French version. In 1945, her mother visits her, and Hemingway happens to be a guest, and so her mother sneaks in an interview with him. And then after the war, she returns without Shabazz and to her career in Paris. And it says they're divorced in 1954, what happens to be the year that he died. So which seems a little bit late because it's mentioned that he's married to another woman much earlier in Cuba. So the dates didn't quite line up. So, but returning to the admiration that and endearment that she had for AE, I just want to read a couple of quotes. About that she writes about AE, and she was definitely could give the the human aspect and also the very spiritual aspect of AE. So she says there are chosen beings who emanate a mysterious radiance. When passers-by come across one of them in the street, they follow one of them with let me start over. There are chosen beings who emanate a mysterious radiance. When passers-by come across one of them in the street, they follow him with their eyes. Those who meet his gaze become overjoyed. Those to whom he speaks feel warmed. All the faces turn instinctively towards him, like flowers toward the sun. By his presence alone, he creates a soothing zone around him. Even those who are originally morose and petty, suddenly before him, as if by miracle, are joyous and kind. And I just wanted to do later years in her life and a list of her works, which she had an impressive career in writing, but still like almost forgotten, and a lot of her books out of print in French. And then this is a description that she gives of AE. And I think, we've spoken a lot about AE, but I think it's important to have that physical view, and it's like you're sitting there with them. So I'll read that. Sunken into his chair, he smokes his pipe, smiling, and the swirls of smoke blend with those of his long white beard that make him resemble God the Father. One would say he hides himself in this fluffy beard. It has invaded all that it could of his face, and the clearing of his forehead, where it could not reach, is threatened by the exuberance of rebellious hair that AE pushes back as soon as the conversation gets animated. His hair, supple and vibrant, surges with wild locks that never could bend to any discipline. AE wears it like a flag. The traits of his face are concealed by so much vegetation, yet they are the most expressive in the world. Under the mustache, one makes out the smile, but all the life is gathered in the eyes of tender gray blue, luminous, pacified, the blue of the sky after the rain. When he leans toward a speaker to listen or to speak to him, his eyes, with an acute gentleness, penetrate him to the very depths. So this passage shows her ability to breathe life into her portraits, and this segment, again, took me a little while to get there, but is on Téry's portrait of James Joyce. At the beginning of publishing Il Débar, the French public, like the Irish, had mixed reactions to Joyce, and especially to Ulysses. And as with her reporting on Irish politics, Téry feels compelled to provide to the French reading public an accurate, non-sensationalized portrait of Joyce's genius and his indisputable literary contribution to Ireland and to the world. So the next part of this talk will be excerpts that I pulled, and she wrote quite a lot about him, and she included a lot of what Valérie Larbaud wrote about Joyce, and I wasn't able to do that. But I had to make choices about what to include, and so I tried to pick things that if you knew things about James Joyce that maybe you had never been exposed to, and so to give you that view. And again, they are my interpretations. So she starts her chapter by talking about giving various reactions to Ulysses or to James Joyce from people on the street.
James Joyce, he is on the sidelines of the Irish movement. He's a cosmopolitan spirit. He is not going to teach you anything about Ireland.
And others, young people mostly, tell me,
James Joyce, he is our greatest writer. He is the master of us all.
people do not speak openly about Joyce in Ireland. His name raises discomfort, but people inexplicably speak about him and whisper his name everywhere. His name raises discomfort. Everyone reads him in hiding. Who in Dublin does not have Ulysses in his drawer? Outside of Ireland, in contrast, the name James Joyce stirs up storms.
Ulysses is the most dirty, obscene, crazy, boring book.
Well done.
Ulysses, the most significant literary event of the century. Amazing work that renews the novel. James Joyce, the most authentic genius, right up there with Rabelais, Shakespeare, Goethe, and Dostoevsky, his peers.
So now in the voice of Simone Téry. So I read Joyce's work. At the risk of disappointing the Irish, I must in truth declare that James Joyce seems to me Irish to the marrow of his bones, as Irish as Yeats, A.E., or Synge. Moreover, Ireland is not going to delay in recognizing its prodigal son and in glorifying him. Yeats already had the courage to publicly declare at the National Games of August 1924 that Joyce's Ulysses appeared to him to be, quote, a more indisputable work of genius than any other book of prose by an Irishman since the death of Synge. Today, and this would be 1924, Joyce is famous throughout the world, and each day fans come to the restaurant where he has his meals in order to get a glimpse of the great man. So this restaurant, again, is, I think you mentioned, Patrick, was Les Trianon, most likely because that was across from the Montparnasse restaurant. And I think I put pictures of the neighborhood. So Montparnasse and the environ. A little bit earlier than 1924, but to give you an idea of... So if the address is still the same, it would be kind of, and the train station is over here, which is now a big shopping center tower, and the train station is moved back. But the restaurant would be roughly here, and that was the old Gare Montparnasse. And of course, the cafes around Montparnasse are well known for a lot of the American writers who came, and it was a big literary and philosophical scene in the 1920s and later. So back to Téry's narration. Okay. It is in this restaurant across from Montparnasse train station that I too could go join James Joyce. Since he refuses interviews with all journalists, I am not committing the error of asking him for one. Instead, I take advantage of his common courtesy. James Joyce is tall and lean, and there is much nobility in his manners. His profile is neat and fine, his nose straight, sharp, his lips thin. A smooth, delicate, rosy tint is spread across his face, curiously giving an impression of paleness. His brown, straight hair is neatly thrown back, bringing out his prominent forehead. He has a little red mustache, a mouche, a little tucked up hair there under his lip, and below that, a small pointed goatee, which elongates even more the long line of his face, and which gives him the air of a fair Mephisto. That's all there is of diabolical in James Joyce. There's a singular softness of his face, almost some listlessness in his gestures. As he has just had a serious operation on his left eye, Joyce is wearing a black eye mask. One cannot see more than his right eye, but what an eye. Enormous, all pupil, all wet, fathomless, blue-gray, like a troubled sea. His gaze, which has the nearly terrifying depth of an abyss seems to attract and possess all that it touches and to know absolutely everything. I ask forgiveness of the members of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, but it seems to me that if God the Father on Judgment Day examines us with the knowing look, without a doubt this look will be that of the same nature as James Joyce. His face is generally cold and passive. James Joyce is a silent man. Who then would imagine this author of Ulysses as a thunderous maniac? When he goes to see his friends, he sometimes stays for entire hours, and entire hours it seems, without opening his mouth. When someone asks him a question, he responds with monosyllables, and then lets the heavy layers of silence fall on the unfortunate speaker. Is this indifference, shyness, or an expressively absorbed internal life? All of that, without a doubt. Apart from his eyes, nothing moves on his face. Sometimes only a furtive smile and a quick glimmer in his eyes reveal all the humor that hides behind the impassive mask. Sometimes he has a little brief laugh, dry, a little hoarse, without joy. But I have been told that when he is with his friends and wants to go to the trouble, James Joyce, a true Irishman, is the most brilliant conversationalist, and one can suspect this while reading Ulysses, where there is, as one critic says, enough humor to make a dozen humors famous. With strangers, James Joyce shows a little haughtiness or reserve, maybe. He seems to withdraw into himself, and by supreme indifference to mark all his perfect independence from the world around him. His disdainful coldness appears to say, you can yell all you want or be quiet. It will not prevent me from being myself. Yet, despite this icy mask, one senses on his face something vibrant and suffering, and then there are the little hands, fine, supple, and nervous. His wife and daughter are sociable and joyful, like true Irish women. He does not say anything. He has only a fleeting smile in response to his daughter's pleasantries. He seems a little helpless in life. For 4 years, living in a hotel, all of his books are in Trieste for lack of an apartment. He suffers from that. He works poorly. How the noise and the laughter from this restaurant and the people who come to see him, whom he did not wish to meet, that must irritate him. Who will find an apartment for James Joyce, the eternal bohemian in exile? Nonetheless, back to the Trianon. The pictures of Joyce about 1924, and then, right, that's the one picture that I was able to find. It doesn't stand anymore for Les Trianon, and there were some recollections of drunken nights around Les Trianon, and I believe at this time they would have been. She didn't say specifically, but that they would have been living in the Victoria Palace, and there's a reference to those initials in Finnegan's Wake. But here we are back at the restaurant. You think of what the servers' uniform would have looked like, and some of the ambiance around the restaurants. And Joyce was notorious for huge tips, so you can imagine that the servers were jumping to help him. So nonetheless, they seem to have a lot of concern for him in this restaurant. The waiter serves him with paternal authority. So back to their table, the server is about to give James Joyce some more sauce for his dish.
Pas de sauce, no sauce.
Mais comment? Pas de sauce? Mais c'est très bon. What? No sauce? But it's very good, affirms the waiter, getting ready to give him some more.
Non, pas de sauce. Je n'aime pas le beurre. No sauce. I do not like butter.
Mais si, je vous assure, il faut de la sauce. Sans ça, c'est trop sec. But yes, I assure you, you must have sauce. Without it, it's too dry. And the server, with authority, gives the sauce to poor Joyce, who protests in vain.
Mais je n'aime pas le beurre. Je n'aime pas le beurre. But I do not like butter. I do not like butter.
This proud fighter, who alone, like Cuchulainn against Queen Maeve's army, stands up to all of Ireland and the entire world, this undefeated champion finds himself without defense against a waiter in the restaurant.
Are you sure you're not interviewing me?
Joyce asks me each time I ask a question how this man, the source of such an uproar, hates publicity and hype, how he seems to want to keep all he can of himself to himself. Since I do not come to interview James Joyce, then I have to do most of the talking. I naturally talk to him about Ireland because I know that is the magic word with him. He is up to date on everything that is happening in the country, where he has not stayed but a few months in 20 years. Each day he reads the Irish newspapers. He pulls some papers from his pockets, photographs, letters, all that relates to Ireland. I tell him he should return to his country after so many political troubles. People are interested in literature again, I tell him. I also say, in reaction to the excesses of nationalism, people are going to turn towards those who held themselves apart from the battle while searching for new paths. That his time had come, and a lot of friends over there in Ireland are impatiently waiting for him. But Joyce has a bitter, skeptical smile.
You are mistaken. No one wants anything to do with me in my country. Here, see what they just wrote about me.
And he shows me a letter where they report, in effect, the official committee in charge of the invitations of the National Games rejected his name almost unanimously. I would like to hear him speak of the great Irish people that I met in Dublin, but each time I utter a name...
Never met him.
Since he always gives me the same response, in the end he accompanies it with a malicious look and a laugh that seems like a triumph. And he adds with a point of pride.
All of my friends are obscure.
Okay. After that, the conversation languages a little. I ask him, you think, don't you, that Irish autonomy is a good thing?
I don't think anything about it at all.
Well, what's your attitude regarding the national movement in Ireland?
To use an expression from your own country, I will say, j'en ai marre. I have had enough.
I believe you already had enough about 20 years ago.
You could say 40 years ago.
He answers me with the utmost seriousness. Let's try something else. Is it true that you followed the plan of Odysseus in your Ulysses?
It's true.
Why?
Each person has his method of work.
Joyce answers laconically. Fortunately, this is not an interview, otherwise I would have come back empty-handed. But if Joyce defends himself so savagely from journalists, he reveals himself entirely in his work, and it is there you must look for him. And chamber music is composed of charming poems in somber and pure lyricism that prolong the great tradition of Elizabethan songs. One is surprised that the author of Ulysses can also be the author of this delicate chamber music. And yet, in the milieu of the most colorful chapters, we can quietly hear the sweet sound of the singing flute in chamber music. And the torrent of lyricism in certain passages of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in Ulysses has its source in this clear, small stream. Dubliners is a collection of short stories. These are not stories strictly speaking with a beginning and an end, but slices of life, like Ulysses, which is a much fatter slice. Joyce brings the characters to life before our eyes and for a few hours, and by their words and gestures, without ever intervening with commentary. They reveal their entire character, their darkest soul. He shows us the most humble people, servants, children, employees, students, petits bourgeois, all that resemble the most ordinary and the least heroic. They are little everyday dramas, hardly expressed, and of which even those who live them are hardly aware. A little boy in love with a young girl who goes off to buy a gift for his beloved at a charity bazaar. He arrives too late and the lanterns go out and he leaves without ever having dared to buy anything. And then she goes on to describe a lot of the plots from Dubliners, but interestingly enough, and it's my favorite story of the Dubliners, she doesn't mention the dead at all. And then back to her critique, she said, there are no characters sacrificed, all interest him. The passers-by are described as lovingly as if they were to become the main characters of a novel. As soon as a man or a woman appears, Joyce seizes them. He immediately presents a full picture of their face and of their character. We would recognize them if we were to run into them in the street. At the moment, we are perfectly familiar with the characters of a story, and we wonder what is going to happen to them. The author abandons us. Since our curiosity is not satisfied, we start to dream about these fleeting characters as we sometimes dream about an acquaintance or passerby whose life is suddenly taken from us. What interests Joyce is not the story, it's the characters. He is above all a painter and a psychologist. Joyce evidently does not see humanity in its beauty, nor does he paint it in black. In these short stories, there are no sentimental outpourings nor Dickensian caricatures. He never complains or becomes indignant, and there is less of the brutal realism à la Maupassant. He hugs reality as close as he can without embellishing it or making it ugly. But in the watchful eye that he brings to his beings, one perceives, in fact, a tender care and almost secret pity. With what intensity these cold, bare narratives make us feel what is pathetic in everyday life, in the lives of people of the most modest means. In the admirable Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, Joyce frees himself from the naturalist influences seen in Dubliners, and for the first time is uniquely himself. Portrait is largely autobiographical. Under the name of Stephen Dedalus, Joyce talks about his childhood, his education with the Jesuits, the terrible religious crisis that liberated him while leaving him profoundly marked by a religious spirit, his progressive awakening and its ferocious will to escape all influences, to leave Ireland in order to be himself. But to be himself, isn't that to be above all Irish? Welcome, O life, cries out Stephen Dedalus at the end of the book.
Okay. I'm leaving for the millionth time to look for the reality of experience and the way to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race.
In Ulysses, we find again magnificently developed all the seeds that are found in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And one feels blown away while tackling Ulysses. It is not only because of its volume, 732 pages, in scrunch character resembling for its mass a phone book, the equivalent of 8 novels. It is especially because Ulysses is, like a world, an enormous and complex work. In it we find the earth, sky, life, love, death, comedy, tragedy, all the soul's aspirations, all the dirtiness of the body. One has already written and will write volumes of this prodigious work. After having analyzed everything that is said in it, it will be necessary to analyze what is not said and what is contained in it yet. A truly impossible enterprise such as that of discovering with science all the secrets of nature. We can talk about Ulysses, but we cannot enclose it in a definition. Ulysses is not a novel, strictly speaking, or rather it reinvents a novel form. Like the short stories of the Dubliners, there is no story in Ulysses with a beginning and an end. James Joyce makes us attend one ordinary day in the life of a man, because Ulysses, like exiles, happens in one single day, and there we find perhaps the concern about unity which Aristotle wanted and that Joyce frequented so much. Each of these innumerable people plays his little note in a gigantic choir so well that Ulysses, which can seem at first a little incoherent, is a symphony, the symphony of a city in which all the gestures, thoughts, and words of the least of its inhabitants find their resonance. If we were able to take in one single look, all that is found in Ulysses, we would immediately seize the soul of the city. But we see the city from above, like the eye of God would. We need a connecting thread in this chaos. This connecting thread is, after Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom. And here we touch on Joyce's biggest innovation, the famous interior monologue. Instead of telling us about the movements and thoughts of each character from the outside, while carefully explaining and commenting as one usually does, the author here makes an abstraction of his own personality. He forgets himself completely and installs himself in the conscious of his character. He does not see the world around his character, but through his character. Like a film, the current of Leopold Bloom's thoughts flows before our eyes. And she goes on to talk a lot about Valerie Larbaud's thoughts on Ulysses, and it just wasn't possible to contain all that she writes about his books, but I'm going to stick to, pulled out again to these last points, things that were unique about Ireland. And how are we doing on time?
Yeah.
Okay. We have to admire in all that will to renew the form of the novel, to open unknown paths. And while searching, James Joyce makes strange or amusing discoveries, and others that are extraordinary, like the interior monologue. Yet we must not forget that Joyce, who is so Irish, belongs to the most witty people on earth, along with the French. The Irish adore making fun of people. They have the genius of mystification. And one can deny that there is mystification in Ulysses. I'm not talking about the obscene realism that does not hesitate before any detail of one's natural needs or sex life, next to which the boldness of Whitman seems naive and sentimental. I'm thinking of all the words without succession, incoherencies, questions, astounding and incomprehensible sentences, unending lists of words, copies of contracts or announcements from newspapers, etc. If Joyce is one of the greatest writers of the English language, he is also a thinker and psychologist. Pages of Ulysses are filled with thousands of philosophical, religious, moral, scientific, aesthetic, and political discussions. If he were to expose his ideas in an intellectual language, one would think he is a doctor of philosophy. These discussions go so well with the rest of the work that one could not suppress them without making the structure collapse in a single blow. Ulysses is nearly an encyclopedia where all the knowledge and ideas of the world find their reflection. Having fulfilled this challenge of enclosing all the most serious and abstract problems in the novel form, this is absolutely miraculous. And through all this, we find the mark of race. This surprising book could only have been written by an Irishman. And it's not because the scene is in Dublin and its characters are Irish. It's because the soul that manifests itself there. The Irish are people hungry for absolutes who leap in a single bound to extremes, whether by sentimental, patriotic, or religious passion. James Joyce has his passion too, and it is a passion for the truth. We French can love truth and we seek it out, but Joyce, he loves it as a lover. He desires it frenetically. He feverishly pursues it. For it, he is ready to sacrifice his whole life and even the health of his soul. It is why he revolts against all that would stand between him and the truth. He said, I am the servant of two masters, says Stephen Dedalus bitterly, an English one and an Italian one, the British imperial state and the Holy Roman and Apostolic Catholic Church. So Joyce stands against these two masters, and all of his works could be explained by this double rebellion. It is the British Empire that gave birth to Irish patriotism. This patriotism is ultimately, thinks Joyce, only another form of slavery. If he does not like the English, Joyce has as much repugnance for the use of crowds. In order to be free, one has to stand apart from the herds. What hatred he has for stupid sentimentality, its attitudes, cries, and lack of dignity. This is why Joyce scoffs so bitterly at Irish patriotism. But believe me, if he had been born 50 years earlier, James Joyce would have stood up alone against British tyranny. And we are getting near the end of the selection. It is the same concern for the truth that prevents him from idealizing the portrait that he makes of Ireland. Here's why his compatriots, whose national pride is so touchy, those same who were howling at Synge's lavish caricatures, forgive him the least. Joyce's genius is indeed eminently satirical, but it is not because they are Irish that his characters are not embellished. Beyond Ireland, Joyce paints the man. It is the whole man he wants to paint. Truth prevents him from stopping at the boundaries of decency. Why not talk about everything that exists since it exists? What one reproaches the most in Joyce is his obscenity. And indeed, he is obscene, like Rabelais, and even more so. And he is Irish. He doesn't want to do things by half, so he is obscene with violence and without compromise. Yet his obscenity does not have traits or motives like some people attribute to him. Joyce does not take pleasure in reporting the obscenity. He does not seek to give it to his readers, but everywhere he encounters it, he is obliged to record it scrupulously. In a word, the symbolism in Ulysses, would it not again be mystification of Joyce, the mystification of Joyce's, of a larger scope than others? We find again here an Irish trademark, the taste for mystery, of the hidden meaning of things, the curiosity for the sciences, occult, in a word, mysticism. Whatever it is, the internal structure of Ulysses is entirely invisible. Not a single sign marks it. The chapters do not have titles or even numbers. If the name Ulysses was not on the cover of the book, we would never think of the Odyssey. Even less if Mr. Valery Larbaud had not informed us of the other connections. And yet, that would not bother us in the least, nor prevent us from sensing all of Joyce's genius. It is why it is not necessary to agonize over these mysteries to which the keys undoubtedly belong to the initiated. And getting near the conclusion here, they reproach Valery Larbaud for his statement, with Ulysses, Ireland is making a sensational and triumphant return to high European literature. But Ireland had already made this comeback with other writers, with W.B. Yeats and with J.M. Synge, for example. And let's not talk about Oscar Wilde and Bernard Shaw of British culture. It is so obvious that James Joyce is one of those who gives the most honor to Ireland, one of those whose soul is most eminently Irish. In all the countries of the world, intellectuals have given Joyce the most resounding welcome. But James Joyce has not forgotten his country. For the 20 years that he has been living in exile, the thought of Ireland has never left him. Will Ireland want to be the last country in the world to recognize the genius of her child? Isn't Ireland going to finally open her arms? And that's how she concludes her chapter on James Joyce.
So this is the amazing Simone Téry. This is a couple of years after Ulysses was published, 1924 or so. And it's a very astute, comprehensive assessment of Joyce. And I think it's about time this book was published in English. And again, Laura, this is Laura's original translation and her interpretation of Simone. So this is new. You guys are hearing an old French, highly astute writer, but in a new form here in the spring school. So.
And if I may, I'd like to take a couple of more minutes to talk about a sort of serendipitous experience around AE that connects to my presentation. So I am staying in Rennes this year. I'm on sabbatical and I'm doing the Diploma of Celtic Studies. And it was a beautiful day. I needed a study break, so I decided to take a walk. And I've gotten to know the center of town quite well. So I was intentionally seeking out streets that I had never been down. And I came across a bookstore that had some spiritual titles. And I I thought, I know there exists a translation of Candle of Vision in French, and I thought if any bookstore in this town has it, I think it would be in here. And so I walked in, and I was searching for the book. I knew there were a couple of translations. And the woman who owns the store was busy talking, and I was looking, didn't find it, and I thought, well, it's probably not here. Maybe I'll just go. This conversation doesn't seem to be ending. And I was reaching for the door, and the bookseller stopped me. She said, "Wait, what are you looking for?" And so I explained, and she gets up on a stool, goes to the top shelf, and she has the book, and she has it by Patrice Repousseau, who I know translated Pamela Travers' L'Amour on the Death of A.E. The small book. So I recognized the name, and I thought that he had done some research on Simone Téry, and maybe he was even working on the translation, but the translation never came about, and so I thought he must have passed away. And she asked me, "Oh, do you know him?" Because I was surprised I read the name, and I said, "No, I don't know him." And I said, "Do you?" And she did. And so she got on the phone and called him, and he gave her his email address, and we started to communicate, and he invited me to his home in Laval, which is about a half an hour from where I'm staying. And he has published a significant book about AE, and I found out his translation of Ile des Bardes is ready to go. So I'm hoping to get those conversations started again about getting that book published. And so if any of you know publishers, then I'd appreciate it if you pass that on. And I do have a short recording of him describing this book on AE himself, and I'm wondering if you'd like to hear it.
Sure.
Yeah, quickly play that. This is Patrice Repousseau, who has done numerous translations and written poetry, which he feels has been given to him, that he has been gifted to write.
The title of my book is A.E. George W. Russell, or The Law of Spiritual Gravitation. Now, I wrote this book because I love A.E. And I have translated his two mystic books, as well as Pamela Travers' account of his death. And I feel deeply connected to him for various reasons. So I wrote a book in two parts. The first parts which make up 107 pages, ends with a statement by Paul Brunton about Patrick Bowen and his master A.E. And it's very interesting because Paul Brunton knew A.E. very well. I have given Laura all the quotations about A.E. That can be found is in Paul Brunton's notebooks. This is the first part. It is interesting. I think it is nothing is new except the fact that I use a lot of marvelous account of A.E. by Constance Sitwell that I use. That takes up about 15 pages about the last weeks of his life. It's very, very beautiful, maybe more so than Pamela Travers and Simone Téry's account of AE, which are already very good.
And which you also translated.
Yes, which I have also translated. The second part, no, I can't stop now. The second part consists of various parts. The first is made up of an account by his master, James Morgan Prize. The second is a translation of The Hero in Man by A.E. himself when he was about 30. Then I translate an account of The Invisible World, or Sid, by A.E., given by A.E., which is very interesting, to put it very mildly.
And who interviewed him in that part?
I can't remember his name. It is mentioned somewhere,
Okay,
but I have no time.
Okay.
I don't have the time to look it up.
That's okay.
Then a few beautiful letter from A.E. to Mount Gibbon as a young poet. It is beautiful too, and followed by about 20 poems taken from the collected poems of A.E. and then articles, a few articles and essays about literature and very spiritual consideration about various subjects. I go very fast then.
Well, this is so we can give an idea.
Just to give you an idea. And then there is a beautiful letter to Van Brooks about Emerson, which is a marvel. There are a few letters, one to George Moore, the other to John Quinn, then to Colin Smiles, then to Van Brooks.
And I'll stop the recording there. And if you're interested in contacting Patrice, I can collect your email and I'd be happy to pass that on. If you'd like to look at the book, I didn't quite play the whole piece. I think there's about a minute or so. But thank you for letting me share that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that he does, and I hope his book is translated. His translation of Il Débard is translated. So, thank you.